The daily drip feed of negative stories about Scotland, its future, and the independence debate, any possible outcome that would put, say, a unionist point of view in a good light would be covered.
The BBC, of course, we have to pay, each of us that pay the licence fee, we have to pay £145.50. Now that's £350 million that goes to the BBC. Of that, only £120 million or so is spent in Scotland.
If there's any negative situation happens in Scotland, the BBC seem to gloat on it. And I've seen some of the presenters positively smile with appreciation when unemployment rises in Scotland.
And it's highlighted and gone over again and again and again.
Well, where do I start? Just about everything they do on the subject is just extremely poor, in my opinion.
They run a story for 2 or 3 days. If it's a negative story, if it's a positive story about Scotland, it's mentioned within the 90-second time slot and it's never mentioned again.
The kind of sleight of hand attacks on Alex Salmond, opportunities to attack the SNP, which I'm not actually in the SNP, but I think they've done a good job in Scotland. And I think that the tactic is this to, if you can't attack the policies, attack the individual.
The BBC issued an official response to a complaint about one of the debates recently, which said, to paraphrase, that we're not in an official campaign period, therefore they don't have to be balanced. That's nonsense. I mean, it's just, the Scottish people deserve better than that.
The way they approach it, it's completely unbalanced, and I'm not a big fan of the BBC.
It's embarrassingly negative, and I think that's going to change.
The BBC is not really fulfilling their brief. They're not fulfilling their charter by having a balanced debate about this referendum, and I'm very disappointed.
We want fair coverage for our licence fee. Otherwise, we don't want to pay for it.
Ban the licence fee.
In fact, as you might know, there was 2 referendums, one at the beginning of the 80s and one in 1995. In both cases, the federal authorities lied to the population about what they would do if if the people voted no. In 1980, the Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau said, if you vote no and you stay in Canada, I give you my word, there will be important constitutional changes. And in fact, the referendum came, and Trudeau did exactly the contrary to what he was supposed to do. So he literally lied to the Quebec people to convince them to vote no.
Oh, if you vote no, then we'll sort something out in the future and keep you happy.
I think on balance, nobody believes a word that man says.
I would recommend that people just ignore what David Cameron has to say.
No, because he's not defined any of the more powers. In terms of the debate, I suppose it's a smokescreen, really.
I think he's got any street cred in Scotland, never mind some parts of England.
I think Cameron's promise of more powers for Scotland, people will see right through that. It's been promised before and it's not happened. Even the Calman Commission has been watered down. What's being offered in the Scotland Act is not even what was proposed by Calman, and even that doesn't go far enough for most people.
I don't know. I wouldn't say he's been dishonest, but there's been a few things said that I don't agree with.
That very much. I think that most people don't really believe anything that the Tories say. I certainly don't.
79, they were offered more powers and some sort of change if they didn't vote no to devolution, and then you have Thatcher come in and basically destroy Scotland's economy overnight.
I think now the media should be playing a more open role in this, providing more balanced and certainly much more in-depth coverage of all the different issues that Scotland needs to talk about and discuss and get out to the general public who are not politically motivated, so that they can make a proper decision in 2014 about the future of our country.
Week before the referendum, the federal government and certain ministers, Brian Tobin and others, discovered that the yes vote was going to win. And they decided to pull out all the stops. And they decided to organize a big demonstration Friday before the vote, which was going to be on a Monday, in downtown Montreal. And they decided to call on all the people of Canada to join in this demonstration. Well, Vancouver is 3,000 miles away from Montreal. And so the minister of the Canadian government started phoning the airlines presidents. Now, these airlines report to the Canadian government. In other words, they're under a Canadian charter, their rights to fly. He phones them and says, we need some planes, we're inviting people to go to Montreal. And the president said, and this is the minister explained this, and he told me this in his own words. He said, you need some planes? We'll provide them. And instead of costing $2,000 to go from Vancouver to Montreal and back to Vancouver, they were selling the tickets for $100. And within 24 or 48 hours, they had 25,000 people coming by plane from Canada to Quebec, to Montreal. Now, this is in total violation of Quebec's laws. They spent more money in that demonstration than the Yes Camp spent on the whole campaign. And they had the nerve to call this Woodstock, a love-in, they called it. As far as I know, that's not a sign of love. That's the absolute opposite. That is a sign of occupying control, and it's an arrogance that is imperial in nature. The publisher of the Toronto Star, who chartered buses and published ads in it, he was saying, when I asked, I said, well, there is a law, don't you have to respect the law? He said, all's fair in love and war, and this was war.
Once you're actually at war, then certain norms come into play about what your side is going to do stuff to win. You wouldn't necessarily do that if you weren't at war, but politics is both like advertising and also, as we've known since the time of Machiavelli and the ancient Greeks, is like war. But there's something very different in the 21st century, which is we now have a much better understanding of how to influence and manipulate people. And advertisers were ahead of the game before politicians, but over the past 30 or 40 years, political communicators have become alert to how to manipulate and influence people using all the tricks of the trade.
One of the most popular and basic propaganda tools is the exploitation of fear, uncertainty, doubt to move people. What they speak of is driving people and other euphemisms for psychological coercion. Fear works. Fear is only partially logical. Now, some things are worth being afraid of. They're dangerous. But when used in the media, that it's quite easy to stir up or pull on people's emotions and their fears in order to move them in one direction or another.
We aim at a vulnerable part of the population and they say, you're not going to have your income.
For the old people, they told them that they would lose their pension.
You're going to be completely drowned by your debt. Your debt is going to be too great.
The money that they have in the bank will also lose its value.
Your credit rating is going to go down.
The Quebec dollar won't be worth anything.
It was one thing after the other, and hundreds of thousands of jobs would be lost.
People that have better jobs would want to go somewhere else.
We're just going to be a Cuba of the North.
Excuse me, but that is bullshit.
You had to have answers to it. And what was one of the strengths in the referendum here was that you had answers to each one of these questions. They were very powerful. They're very powerful threats. Economic threats are extremely powerful because you're trying to get people to realize that their interests are in an independent Quebec. Well, then you see, but then at the end of the day, they sit there and say, well, am I going to have work tomorrow? Am I going to be able to feed my family? Am I going to be able to make sure that, are we going to be prosperous or not? So those threats were powerful, non-stop, and it takes a lot of economic thought and education during a campaign to make sure that people don't get sucked in.
Unfortunately, I think scare tactics will have quite a big influence on the result. People are naturally quite wary of change.
Well, scare tactics, it's difficult to say what influence it's having.
Well, it's difficult to say at the moment.
Diminishing by the day. People are becoming inured to the amount of negative publicity.
It's the same scare tactics that were being used in 79 and 97 that are being used again now for independence.
It's all right to criticise the SNP and the Yes campaign, but it's actually criticising the people of Scotland.
They're being bombarded constantly with all of these things that are supposedly going to happen that are going to have a terrible impact on our day-to-day lives.
I think some people are affected by these scare stories.
I'm not too sure. I'm worried about this. I'm going to vote no.
It could be that they may run into trouble later on when some people start realising that they are what they are. They are just scare stories.
I think it's really important to get the positive message out there and to show that it's just not the case.
If we can, for the next 18 months, can combat that with good information, with informing people as much as possible what we think are the important things about the move towards independence.
Yeah, scare tactics may well work in the short term, but I think long term, you need more than scare tactics. You need a vision, you need a message. And I think scare tactics, I think ultimately they fail.
As far as scare tactics and what the overall effect of scare tactics, including the threats, continual threats, and then the love-in, which was more like an occupation. It had all the trappings of an occupation of Quebec. they definitely had an influence.
Oh, I'm sure it had an impact. I'm sure that it had an impact. You had all these huge billboards across Quebec, because just before the referendum, they bought practically they reserved all the billboards in Quebec to put their propaganda message on them. And there was messages on the radio, there was indirect propaganda by large enterprises. No, I'm sure that it scared people. We really lost by a very, very thin margin, less than 1%. It would have sufficed that about 35,000 people decided to vote yes instead of no, for us to have a majority of 50% plus 1. Now, how did they manage to achieve that? There was a lot of illegal and unconscionable methods that were used.
Canadian government funneled enormous amounts of money.
Millions of dollars were spent illegally.
All kinds of money which were spent illegally.
A secret slush fund of many millions of dollars.
Every single billboard throughout Quebec had been reserved and paid in advance by the federal government.
These people want to win, and they want to win by every means.
The ends justify the means.
Official media will have a tendency to go with the crowd and amplify.
They will give credence to the stupidest arguments.
We won't recognize the vote even if it's a majority vote.
They will give ink to people who will make threats.
They'll fly out all the planes from air bases in Quebec, and they'll truck out the equipment and the tanks.
They give free rides to the Federalists, but they don't give any free rides to the sovereigntists.
You have positive sides and you have bad sides. You have heroes and you have sons of bitches.
Propaganda is well known to have a very damaging effect on democracy.
Spin isn't just something that is the production of political spin doctors. It's something that's a feature of political communication through the whole process of, from a politically relevant event happening to it's actually appearing on your television screen or on your internet screen or in your newspaper in the morning.
Not only is there a bias in terms of what physically or what literally appears on a screen, there is a bias in terms of who gets onto the screen. And this, in some ways, is a much more powerful bias.
Cultures can evolve. A culture of insincerity, a culture of political spin can evolve and get very, very deeply entrenched, because it would be irrational in that kind of cost-benefit sense for any particular person to go, do you know, I think we're going to be sincere from now on. We're not going to engage in spin and counter-spin and nullifying the opponent's message and so on. We're not going to do that. We're just going to speak sincerely and honestly. That's political suicide. You might as well give up.
Now, you can send a letter to the television station, or you can put something on YouTube or something like that. But in terms of actual participation in the content of this very powerful medium, in substantive decisions about this powerful medium, basically you have no vote. People who believe they're being lied to, number one, they may very well be right. You know, there's an old saying is that even paranoids have real enemies.
if we are misled, if we are led to believe that things are a certain way and not another way, such that our decisions are shaped in light of that, then in a sense, democracy is undermined.
One of the oldest tricks in the book for media organizations of every stripe is that you get a critic on from this side of the frame and they say, oh, the XYZ television network is completely biased on the side of my opponent on the other side. Then you get a critic from the other side and say, oh, the XYZ television network is completely biased on the side of my opponent. And then the audience is left to think, oh, well, I guess XYZ is pretty on the mark. The problem is that XYZ has created this frame.
When we feel we've been duped, that's apt to lead to very, very strong emotional feeling, and rightly so, because we think, well, our trajectory through our lives, our decisions have been guided by somebody else. Our autonomy has been undermined by somebody else. We acted in a way that we wouldn't have acted, and we were controlled by them.
You have the right to choose freely what your political status will be. And what they're doing is they're saying, no, you don't have the right to choose that freely. Because what they're doing is they're influencing illegally the results of this consultation.
The English network was really biased in favor of the no side, and that's independent reports that put out that information after the referendum, and the justification of the federal government and the CBC's English network was to say, well, maybe we were biased, but the majority of English-speaking people in Quebec were against.
If we agree that nations have the right to determine their future, then you cannot have Westminster, Ottawa, deciding that, well, we're going to make our own law. We're going to do what we want. This decision to determine the future of a nation has to be made by the people who live in that nation. That's fundamental.
You probably had the same problem that we had here. We had only minor nationalist newspaper. Most of the important press, most of the television networks were federalists and were against. Maybe there could be in Scotland some sort of committee of people that are independent, that look at the propaganda and mark it and say, this is totally false because of that. This is right, and to assess the big things that are being said in the debate.
Don't trust the polls. In April 1995, or no, February 1995, there was this massive poll organized by CBC, Radio-Canada, a very massive poll, and it showed that Quebec, the yes forces would only get 40%, which is what they'd had in 1980. Well, we came within a half percentage point of winning. In other words, we got close to 50%, and we were up over 50% until they started using all kinds of other methods to beat Quebec.
The advice or the message is we have to not take things at face value. Don't look at something and say, well, oh, look, it says this. Think, well, hang on, think, well, whatever it says has been decided upon by someone to influence you.
So understand that about television so that you can divorce yourself from its really very strong ability to kind of suck you into it and to shape your attitudes at levels below your actual consciousness, your day-to-day consciousness.
It's that kind of becoming a sophisticated listener, a sophisticated reader, a sophisticated viewer. That's the only kind of avenue of defense against a culture of spin. And there will be a culture of spin.
And I think one of the most important things to do is to just turn it off. Just turn it off and explore other sources of information. There's lots of them out there.
In the time of a referendum or an election, you are the recipient of 100 years of the psychology of manipulation being filtered through institutions who are seeking to manipulate you for their own end. Now, their own ends may be one you agree with. You might think, oh, it's fine, I don't mind having this stuff from my party. Oh, look, in fact, they're doing a really good job. I really love their brochure. Maybe other people are going to vote and we'll all get what I want. But at the same time, we should all be alert to what's going on. We are being manipulated.